Hello, everybody. Happy Halloween, almost. I do love this eyeball. Hello. Welcome back to part 2 of Harry Hardman versus Halloween, the read-through, with me, Alexander Gordon-Smith. Hopefully you've all seen the first part, otherwise this isn't going to make a lot of sense. Just to catch you up, we are on part 2 of this is the middle grade book that I wrote. It hasn't yet been published. It's about an 11-year-old boy called Harry Hardman who lives in a very small house with his 4 sisters and his mother. His father was a coal miner and died when the tunnels collapsed. I would say about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. And actually, it must be 6 years ago. And yeah, they haven't got much money, but Harry doesn't have a great time at school, but Harry's one true joy in life is Halloween. He loves Halloween. It's his favourite day of the year. He watches horror movies all through the year, movies he definitely shouldn't be watching when he's 11 years old. But yeah, really enjoys Halloween. This year, he made the most amazing Halloween costume ever. Out of papier-mâché and old food, disgusting, stinky food. He invented a character called Dr. Slasher von Zompire Wolf and Roboterstein, as you can see here. This is the official licensed action figure for a book that hasn't come out yet. Which was kind of part zombie, part alien, part werewolf, part vampire, part Frankenstein's monster. And yeah, and he's getting ready to kind of go out and trick or treat every year. Him and his best friend, his only friend, Buster, go out trick or treating, and they get a load of sweeties and candy, and then they just sit and watch horror movies all night. And that's his dream. That's the one day of the year where he feels really happy. But this year, Buster, who is also 11, has decided that he doesn't want to do childish things like trick-or-treating. He wants to go to the most amazing party the town has ever seen. Up in the hills, where the rich kids live. And unfortunately, this party is a fancy dress party, Halloween fancy dress ball, being thrown by Mike Carey. Mike is the town's biggest bully, and he hates Buster and he hates Harry. So they're going to go in disguise, and he's managed to convince... Mike's bad enough, but Mike also lives with his older brother, Jonah, who, as legend would have it, threw a boy down the mine shaft at the back of their house once because he was so annoyed with him. So everyone knows that Jonah is a very, very scary guy. Anyway, and he's on the school football team, and all the kids on the football team are quite scary. Buster has managed to convince Harry to come to the party, and Harry thinks, well, maybe it'll be all right because, I've got this amazing costume. No one will know it's me, and then maybe at the end of the night, I'll take my costume off, and everyone will be like, Harry's amazing. He's built the best Halloween costume we've ever seen, and it might be his key to popularity. Not that he really wants to be popular. However, on Halloween, a couple of hours before the party is due to begin, Harry gets home from his chores to discover that his dog, Dizzy, has eaten his costume. So now he has no costume to go to the ball. This story is basically Cinderella, I've just realised. Anyway, so yeah, Harry has just found his costume and he doesn't know what to do. So this is, I don't number the chapters, I just gave them the titles. I'll try and get through a good chunk today. This chapter is called The World's Worst Halloween. Code Red! Harry yelled as he burst back into the kitchen. He was doing his best to carry Dr. Slasher von Zompire Wolf and Roboterstein in his arms, but the costume was so badly mangled that pieces kept spilling to the floor, leaving a trail across the yard and up the steps into the house. Dizzy snapped at his heels, his big tail thumping, and Harry threw the costume on the table next to Charlene before grabbing the dog's collar and hauling him back outside. Ew! Charlene's voice chased him out the door. Gross! Harry hustled the dog into his pen, then dashed back to the shed. There were pieces of costume everywhere, scraps of fur, lumps of half-chewed face flesh, ribbons of silver material. It was horrible. It was like he actually had been torn to pieces by a werewolf. By a stupid Dalmatian, at least. Harry was almost in tears as he collected the scattered remains, his fingers numb from the wet grass. He carried them into the warmth of the kitchen, resting them on the table and using one arm to sweep the lunch stuff to the floor to make room. There was still time. There was still time to save him. That was Rule 12 in the list, after all. If it's dead, it can and probably will be brought back to life. But he needed help. He ran to the phone, pulling it out of its cradle and dialing Buster's number. Then he ran back to the table, the cord trailing behind him. This book, by the way, is set like in the 1980s, 1985. No mobile phones. He counted the rings. He surveyed the damage. Ring, ring. One of the gloves was ripped in a dozen places, all but one of the fingers gone. Ring, ring. The silver pants had a huge hole in the crotch and were encrusted with dirt. Ring, ring. The Astro-Destructoid combat control panel was in tatters. Literally every single button chewed to oblivion. Ring, ring. And the helmet, the pride and joy of his costume, was gone. It was currently digesting inside Dizzy's stomach. Ring, ring. Oh, Buster, thank God, Harry burst out. He's dead. He's gone. The dog murdered him. He ate every last bit of him. And now I don't know what to do because it's Halloween and it's ruined. He's dead and I need help. I need you to help me fix him. Code Red. Code Red. He stopped to suck in a breath, only to hear Mrs. Bird, Buster's permanently weary mother, sigh. Oh, hello, Harry. Let me go and get him for you. Harry eyeballed Charlene and Marlene as he waited, wondering if it was possible to hate them with such power that their heads would spontaneously combust. He tried to make it happen, but all it ended up doing was giving him a thumping headache. Cackling, they strolled from the room as if nothing bad had happened. He searched the table for something to throw at them, but then Buster was on the line. "Come, Red! Code now!" he spluttered. He slammed the phone back onto the cradle, then turned back to the corpse of Dr. Slasher von Zompire Wolf and Roboterstein. If this was one of his stories, Harry could fix him in seconds. All he had to do was fire up his lab, harness the energy of a lightning bolt, stitch him back together with body parts from the local cemetery. But this was just a kitchen, and an empty one at that. How was he supposed to bring his creation back to life with half a box of Cheerios and a packet of wafers? He set to work anyway, grabbing his mum's sewing kit from her bedroom and the art box from beneath his bed. "Just hang in there," he said as he worked, attempting to patch the pants with a dish towel. "Stay away from the light." After 10 minutes, he realised he couldn't sew, so he ripped open the cereal box and started drawing buttons and gauges on the reverse side of the cardboard. But it was useless, and even though he worked for half an hour straight, it still looked rushed. And what good was a combat suit anyway, when you didn't even have a face? It was as he was hurling his felt tips across the room that he felt a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, turning to see a zombie there, oozing green gunk from the rotting mess of its skin. He almost screamed before recognising Buster's face beneath the makeup. "I came," Buster wheezed, "as quickly," he clapped a hand to his heart, "as I could." He looked past Harry, and his jaw dropped. "Is that—" "Yes," said Harry, turning back to his creation. "You have to help me. I'll find something for the head. You start sewing. Stat!" "Harry," said Buster. "No, wait, you go and look in Charlene's room. I need anything furry or silver." "Harry, dude," said Buster. "It's over." "No," said Harry. He stared at the costume through tears, wiping them away on his sleeve. Buster put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing. "He's dead, Harry," he said. "He's gone." "No!" Harry shouted, slamming a fist down on the table hard enough to rattle the condiments. But Buster was right. Dr. Slasher von Zompire Wolf and Roboterstein was no more. It was all Harry could do not to sink to his knees, and he gripped the table to hold himself up. "It's not fair, it's not fair, it's stupid Charlene and Marlene's fault." "They ate your costume?" asked Buster, picking Cheerios off the table and popping them into his mouth. "No," said Harry. "Dizzy did, but they let him. What am I going to do?" Buster shrugged. His costume was actually pretty sweet, Harry thought. He'd cut out strips of bubble wrap and stuck them to his cheeks and chin and forehead, wrapping it around his hair, and he'd smeared the whole lot with green and brown paint. It looked as if his skin had bubbled up thanks to some horrific disease. He was wearing an old boiler suit, probably one he'd stolen from his dad, because the legs had been rolled up several times around his ankles. He must have been rolling around in the yard, because it was filthy. Even his hands were thick with grime, his nails black as he dived past Harry for more Cheerios. Only his glasses, perched on top of his nose, gave him away. "I don't know," he said, spraying crumbs, "but whatever it is, do it now. It's 6:30. The party starts imminently." Harry gripped his hair with both hands as he turned to the clock on the cooker. Buster was right. Time had suddenly sped up, as if the universe was playing a cruel joke on him. The panic roared between his ears, and again he felt the prickle of tears in his eyes. A whole year of waiting for this one amazing day, and now it was ruined. You must have an old costume, said Buster. What about the one from last year? Last year, Harry had dressed as a vampire, complete with about a gallon of fake blood he'd made from corn syrup and food dye. He'd got the recipe from Stacey Cacker at school, but she'd forgotten to mention that it permanently stained anything it touched, including, in Harry's case, his skin, the living room carpet, the sink, the dog, the toilet, and his mum's work uniform. His mum had thrown it in the trash the minute he'd got home from trick-or-treating. I don't have anything, he said. All my old costumes have gone. Mine too, said Buster. But we can make you something, like we can cut some holes in a sheet. You can be a ghost. Mum will turn me into a real ghost if I do that, said Harry, and there's no time for anything else. Dude, you have to have a costume. It says so on the invitation. And besides, if you don't, then Mike'll just throw you out. Or Jonah will throw me down the mine, Harry thought. He pulled out a chair and slumped into it, elbows on his knees, pushing his palms against his eyes until fireworks burst against the darkness. All he could hear were his sisters in the other room, still laughing, and Buster crunching Cheerios. My mum's waiting outside, Buster said. She's going to drive us up the hill. Just go without me, said Harry. Leave me here. Rule 8, said Buster, grabbing Harry's shoulders and shaking them. Nobody gets left behind on Halloween. Come on, man. Think! Think! He was thinking. He could practically hear the gears of his brain grinding. Maybe this was a good thing. Maybe Buster would go to the party without him, and then he would have time to make another costume before going out trick-or-treating. It wouldn't be as much fun by himself, but at least he wouldn't have to share all the full-size Snickers bars with Buster. Hey, dorks, what's up? Harry peeked through his fingers to see Darlene standing in the kitchen door. She was wearing all black, with 6 extra limbs sewn into her dress, made from stuffed stockings. She'd used face paints to give herself 6 extra eyes, and all of them seemed to be looking right at Harry. Great costume, Dee, Buster blurted out. I love it. The eyes, the things on your dress. You're a many-armed, eye monster. Yes, Buster, said Darlene, otherwise known as a spider. That's what I was going to say, Buster said, a spider. Which reminds me, I know a great joke about spiders. Not now, Buster, Harry almost screamed. Darlene looked past Harry to see the remains of his costume. Oh, she said. That sucks. Sorry, bro. I know how hard you worked on it. Harry wiped his sleeve over his nose, sniffing. Stupid dog, he said. He needs another one. Stat, said Buster. Otherwise he can't come to the party. Darlene smiled. Well, why didn't you say so, she said. I've probably got something upstairs. There's no way I'm wearing that. Harry bolted along the hall, clattering up the stairs, his arms windmilling as he flew into Darlene's room. He was going so fast he thumped into her chest of drawers, knocking over 2 of the framed photographs displayed there. He grabbed the top drawer and wrestled it open, elbow deep in clothes by the time Darlene walked into the room. Hey, said a little voice behind him. He turned to see Arlene on the bottom bunk, her face a giant frown. She was dressed as a clairvoyant, with a glittering headscarf and one of his mum's shawls. Instead of a crystal ball, she had a magic 8-ball clamped between her legs. Those are my things, she said. You can wear them if you like, said Darlene, walking into the room, but I wouldn't advise it. She slammed the drawer shut and walked to the wardrobe in the corner of the room, her spider legs jiggling. Harry paced back and forth, hands in his hair. He could hear the tick, tick, tick of the clock in the hallway downstairs, each passing second like a nail hammered into a coffin lid. Buster appeared, smoothing back his hair. I love your room, Darlene, he said. Very classy. Not the time, Buster, snapped Harry. Anything? Darlene emerged from the wardrobe holding a bundle of fabric as black as a vampire's cloak. Harry's heart had almost lifted before she unravelled it, revealing a dress, long and shiny. You could be a demon witch, she said with a shrug. I've got the horns in here somewhere. A dress? Said Harry, pulling a face. No way, Dee. Do you have any idea what they'll do to me if they find out it's me? It needs to be something with a mask, said Buster, sitting on the bottom bunk and making it squeak, so nobody sees his face. You've got a lovely face, Harry, said Arlene, shaking the 8-ball. Darlene raised an eyebrow. She leaned back into the wardrobe and pulled out a grocery bag, shaking its contents to the floor. Harry dived for it like it was a piñata, grabbing fistfuls of glitter and satin and cotton wool. There was a glimmer of something big and metallic, and he plucked it free of the pile. You wanted a mask, Darlene said, gesturing at it. That's a mask. He turned it around, wondering if Darlene had dressed as a killer robot one Halloween, or maybe even a cyborg. But the metallic glint wasn't copper panelling, or bulletproof steel. It was just glitter. A lot of glitter. Most of it was silver, but there were streaks of pink stretching out from the nose, like whiskers, and a purple butterfly on the forehead. "What," said Harry, feeling close to throwing up, "in the name of all that's scary, is this?" "Duh," she said, "a princess mask for the royal ball." Harry turned to Buster, who nodded sagely. "Nobody will know it's you," he said, "and it's kind of cool, I guess." "No, Buster," said Harry, "it's not. There's no way I'm wearing this. I mean, it's a princess." "Not just any princess," said Darlene, lifting a set of shimmering green wings from the floor. "A fairy princess." A car horn blared outside the window, making Buster jump. "Come on, Harry," he said, the bed creaking as he stood. "It's either this or nothing." Nothing sounded like the better option right now. But it was Halloween, and Harry couldn't think of anything worse than staying home alone on the best night of the year. Buster was right. If he kept the mask on, then nobody would know it was him. He could just find a quiet corner and wait out the party. Then they could go trick-or-treating afterwards, like Buster promised. "Put these on," said Darlene, holding out a rainbow-coloured wig and a plastic crown studded with gems. "It'll cover your hair." Harry's mouth dropped open, but he took the wig and crown from his sister and clutched them to his chest. "It can't just be a mask and wings," he said. "There must be something else." Darlene smiled, holding out a short plastic wand with a silver star on the end. "You'll be the cutest fairy princess at the party," she said. Ugh. Harry snatched it off her, carrying the bundle into the bathroom and slamming the door behind him. He could see his ghostly reflection in the mirror, and he held up a hand to hide his shame. Then, because he couldn't think of anything else to do, he worked the wig over his head. It felt disgustingly cold and hairy, like he was wearing a dead poodle, but when he checked the mirror again, he saw that Darlene was right. The red and green and yellow and orange and purple and blue hair hung down over his ears and past his shoulders. He rested the crown on top, then slid the mask on, the elastic snapping behind his head. It covered his whole face, with just 2 holes for the eyes and a small slit for the mouth, and it was surprisingly comfortable. More importantly, there was no way anyone could tell that it was him. Harry turned his head from side to side, the hair swishing, but the mask was snug and secure. He pulled out some of the hair and let it fall over his forehead. Weirdly, it almost looked cool. No, he said to himself, it didn't look cool, it looked awful, but it would have to do. He took a deep breath, then opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. Buster and Darlene were waiting for him, and it was pretty obvious they were both trying not to laugh. "See," said Darlene, shaking. "It's perfect." "It's adorable," said Buster. He bit his lips between his teeth, snorting through his nose. "I mean, it's terrifying." "I hate both of you," said Harry, as Arlene walked out onto the landing, the silver charms of her headdress jangling. She looked at Harry and smiled. "I like it," she said. The horn blared again. "Honestly, it looks great," said Buster. "Now come on before Mum spontaneously combusts." Harry paused, looking up the attic steps to the gloomy comfort of his bedroom. The temptation to shut himself in, to pull the steps up behind him like a drawbridge, was almost too much to resist. He sighed, following Buster and Darlene downstairs. He pulled his bomber jacket from the peg by the door, zipping it up and shivering at the thought of the cold. "Don't forget these," said Darlene, holding out the wings. "No fairy princess is complete without her wings." Harry didn't have any fight left in him, and he looped his arms through the hoops. The wings hung limply from his back, as happy about this arrangement as Harry was. "And this," his sister said, tucking the wand into Harry's jacket pocket. "Now go have fun. It's Halloween." Buster was halfway out the front door, as eager as Dizzy before a walk, but Harry went the other way, heading for the kitchen. "Just give me 1 second," he yelled back. Luckily, Charlene and Marley were nowhere to be seen, and he pushed through the back door into the chill of the yard. Dizzy was sitting in his kennel, tail between his legs, and Harry pointed a finger of death at him before running into the shed. Scraps of the doctor still lay everywhere, and the bittersweet fug of old food hung in Harry's nostrils as he searched the shadows. It took him a minute or so to find the first of his dad's old mining boots, and he picked it up, ripping off the first sole. He put the boot on, tying the laces as tight as they would go. Then he limped and hobbled in circles until he found the second one lying beneath the shelves. "There," he said to himself as he pulled the last of the fur away. At least the doctor would be with him in spirit. And not just the doctor, he thought as he straightened. He ran a finger along the row of VHS tapes on the shelf in front of him. Pictures of werewolves and demonic puppets and zombie kangaroos looked back at him, almost in pity. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I'm going to a Halloween party and I'm dressed as a fairy princess." He could almost hear the rumble of his dad's laughter, and the thought of his smile seemed to make the shed blaze with daylight. Harry closed his eyes, felt the strength of his dad's arms when they wrapped themselves around him. He could just about remember Halloween when his dad was still around. Snippets, like scraps of film or an old videotape. A hokey vampire costume, plastic teeth, the rush of being lifted up onto his dad's shoulders when the scary kids walked by. The memory was so powerful, Harry could almost smell him, that mix of bitter coal and sweet bubble bath. "Please, Dad," he said. "Please let this be a good night. Please let this be the most exciting Halloween ever. The scariest Halloween ever. Please. I wish it. I wish it with all my heart." He took in a long, shaky breath. Then he opened his eyes. There was just the shed and Dizzy's whimpers from the pen, and then another blast from the horn, this one going on for 5 full seconds. "I gotta go," he said to his dad. Then, with a flap of his wings and a swish of his rainbow hair, he bolted for the car. The party. From hell. They could hear the party before they saw it. A pulse of sound that tobogganed down the hill, even louder than the roar of Mrs. Bird's enormous Volvo. Harry and Buster were in the back, Buster leaning between the front seats and panting like a dog. If he had a tail, thought Harry, it would be thumping from side to side like a demolition ball. Harry slid up his mask and pushed his forehead against the cool glass, staring into the darkness of the forest as the car wove back and forth up the winding hill road. At the start of the journey back in town, he'd seen dozens of kids dressed up, Mad Hatters, voodoo priests, serial killers, Ronald Reagans, WWF wrestlers, horror movie legends, and about 1,000,000 Ghostbusters. Even the town cops were dressed in bandanas and eye patches, their cruisers decorated like pirate ships, complete with cardboard cannons mounted to the roofs. But the hills were practically deserted. The houses here too far apart to make it worthwhile for trick-or-treating, even if you could get past the gates. There was just the forest and the dark, and Harry wondered if he could ask her to get out of the car here so that he could lose himself in both. "That's it!" screeched Buster, craning forward and pointing. They were turning a corner, and suddenly, out of the night, rose a behemoth of light. The beat of the music thumped into the car like a physical force, like it meant to push them right back down the hill. "Stop the car, Mum! Stop before someone sees you!" Mrs. Bird tutted. She was wearing a headband with pointed cat ears and had drawn whiskers on her cheeks, much to Buster's disgust, as she was far too old for Halloween. Buster tugged on her black cat sweater until she pulled the Volvo over to the side of the road. "Lights!" Buster roared, almost falling him to the front as he made a grab for the stick. His mum fought him back, switching off the high beams and plunging them into darkness. Buster turned to Harry, and even through the mess of his face, even though the layers of oozing green bubble wrap, his grin shone impossibly bright. Harry couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his friend so happy, and the thought of it seemed to open up a shaft of cold darkness inside him. "That music is very loud," said Mrs. Bird. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" "No," Harry almost said, but Buster was nodding so furiously his mask was in danger of slipping loose. "This is going to be amazing," he said to Harry, pushing his glasses back up his nose. "Our first real party. Come on." Buster popped his door and almost fell out into the street. "I'll be here at 9, his mum shouted over her shoulder. But Buster had already gone, running around the back of the car. He ripped open Harry's door hard enough to make him flinch. Then he grabbed his arm and dragged him out into the night. Mrs. Bird leaned over, yelling, "9, Buster, don't be—" Buster slammed the door shut, walking down the street like a conquistador who'd just stumbled across El Dorado. From here, the Carey place did almost resemble a castle, surrounded by a tall wall, its spiked gates open. The house itself was a square box, its walls more glass than concrete. All of the lights were on, and it blazed fiercely, an island of light in the darkness. Even from here, Harry could see a crush of people inside, moving like an ocean in a storm. There had to be hundreds of them. Oh, he put a hand to his stomach, groaning. It felt like there were hundreds of people dancing down there too, trampling his organs. He burped acid, felt as if he was going to vomit. Buster was oblivious, almost running as he made his way to the house. Harry turned to the Volvo, wondering if he should just dive back inside and tell Mrs. Bird to floor it. But he couldn't leave Buster alone, and besides, the car was already performing a delicate turn in the road, the headlights only snapping back on as it roared down the hill. It disappeared into a soupy fog that was rising up from town, and Harry shivered as he watched it vanish. "Come on!" Buster yelled, waddling up the street. "We're missing it!" Oh, Harry took a deep breath. Then, because there was nothing else to do, he followed his friend. The house grew bigger with every step, as if it was a whale that meant to swallow him whole. By the time he reached for the gates, the music was loud enough to feel in his chest. Buster was waiting for him there, suddenly nervous. "You ready?" he asked. "Yeah," said Harry, hoping the lie wouldn't show. "Let's do this." Buster nodded, then turned away, then turned back. You might want to put your mask down," he said, before Mike sees you. Harry's heart gave a mighty kick as he remembered the mask, and he yanked it over his face, fluffing out his wig and clutching his wand in his hand. Buster nodded in approval, then trotted across the sweeping driveway to the house's huge double doors. There were people clustered outside them, older kids smoking cigarettes and howling with laughter. The music changed, a track that Harry recognised because Charlene and Arlene played it all the time at home, Cars, by Gary Newman. It boomed out into the night, so loud that it seemed to grab Harry and spin him around. "Oh, please," said Harry, screwing his eyes shut until the dizziness had passed. "Please let this be a good Halloween." The fear threatened to hold him back, to root him to the ground. Then he thought of his dad, walking into the elevator that would take him deep down into the mine, into the endless dark. Harry Hardman Sr. had taken that journey every day for most of his life. He'd been the bravest and strongest man Harry had ever known, the bravest and strongest man the town had ever known. If he could march into the bowels of the earth like that, pickaxe on his shoulder, then Harry could walk into a party dressed like a fairy princess. Gritting his teeth and feeling the warmth of his breath trapped inside the plastic mask, he marched up to the doors. There were 4 kids there, all in Jonah Carey's grade at school. 2 girls, a zombie cheerleader and a demon, and 2 guys, both on the football team and both dressed like wolves with masks and gloves. They all stared at Buster and Harry as they walked up the steps, and Harry waited for one of them to grab him, to shout for Mike. But the mask was working, because they all turned away, carrying on with their conversation. Harry's heart kicked again, but this time he was surprised to feel a smile spread across his face. He followed Buster into an entrance hall that was bigger than his entire house, a wide, sweeping staircase in the centre of it. People danced around, jumping up and down. The music pounded at Harry's ears, almost hypnotic. He wanted to dance, but he forced himself not to. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. Buster said something that was lost in the deafening tune, pushing through the crowd of Frankenstein's monsters, skeletons, T-birds and pink ladies, Wookiees, Reagans and gorillas. Harry walked after him into an equally enormous living room. This had to have been where the music was coming from, because the huge space was almost bursting at the seams. Harry saw angels and devils, cops and robbers, cowboys and pirates, astronauts and aliens, soldiers from every time period, and right in the middle of the room, half again as tall as everyone else, a T-Rex, grinning like it was about to have the feast of its life. Everybody was dancing, a sea of movement that threatened to drown him. And the weird thing was, he almost liked it. Buster pushed into the middle of the crowd and started jumping, his hands in the air as the track changed to another one Harry knew, Temptation. He was grinning like an idiot, and Harry felt himself grinning too. He did a little jump, just to test it, and it felt great. So he did another, bigger, and another, and soon he too was bouncing up and down to the rhythm of the music. Somebody thumped into him, knocking him into a couple of older kids who were dancing cheek to cheek. He spun around, apologising, only to see Mike Carey there. He was dressed as a wolf too. A white one, his costume almost professional, with a furry mask and claws that were good enough for a horror movie. He flashed Harry a look, one that seemed to peel away his mask and see the face beneath. Then he just smiled, clapped Harry on the shoulder, and pushed away through the crush of people. Harry looked at Buster. Buster looked at Harry. Then they were both laughing. Harry still had that lead weight inside his stomach, but for the first time he wondered if it really was fear, because the truth was, he wasn't afraid right now. He was excited. "I told you," said Buster, leaning in to shout the words into Harry's ear. "This is the new us. We belong." Harry looked through the sea of people, out of the huge window to where the fog was swirling across the driveway. Compared to the party, the thought of being outside in the rain and the cold and the fog, traipsing from house to house, almost felt disappointing. Was Buster right? Was this where he belonged? Adjusting his mask and flicking his hair, Harry danced. Maybe this really was going to be the best Halloween ever. Fever dream. It was almost like a dream, a fever dream where everything is impossibly strange but breathtakingly real. Beneath his sweaty mask, Harry jumped and danced and laughed, all things that he really hadn't done for a long time now. The music never stopped, apart from once when one of Jonah Carey's drunken friends staggered into the DJ's deck and sent it flying, and its effect on Harry was nothing short of magic. It seemed to lift him up and whirl him around, making him lighter than air. He felt it in every cell, so much louder than his sister's little boombox, and he loved it. His mask kept him invisible. At one point he even found himself right in front of Charlene during a conga. He was sure she was going to discover it was him, especially when she put her hands on his doughy waist. But 5 minutes and a circuit of the house later and she was none the wiser. She even gave him a giddy hug before walking away with one of her friends. But this wasn't like the invisibility that he was cursed with every day. Here, he wasn't Harry Hardman, Ghost Roach. It was a good invisibility. People saw him, they danced with him, they even handed him glasses of fruit punch, with straws thankfully so he could drink them through his mask, but nobody knew it was him. He may have been dressed as a fairy princess, but at this party he could have been anybody. He was almost glad that Dizzy had eaten Dr. Slasher von Zompire Wolf and Roboterstein, although he felt horribly guilty for even thinking it. He was enjoying himself so much that by the time he stopped dancing, his legs aching from the effort and his jaw aching from the grin he wore beneath his mask, nearly 2 hours had flown by. He pushed his way through the crowd, his magic wand clenched in his hand, emerging back into the entrance hall. Somebody must have set off a dry ice machine because there was a thin gauze of smoke swirling above the marbled floor. "What did I tell you?" said Buster as he squeezed out behind him. His glasses steamed up. He was sweating like a sumo wrestler in a sauna, and some of the paint on his face had begun to run. If anything, though, it made him look even more disgustingly awesome. "Is this the coolest or what?" Even through Harry's mask, Buster must have been able to see his smile. He thumped Harry on the shoulder. "Come on," he said, "let's grab some more punch. I'm melting in there." Harry was melting too, the wig unbearably hot and itchy. He half thought about taking it off, but he couldn't risk it. He could do with dousing his head in cold water, though. "I need to use the restroom," he said, the mask muffling his words. "There's like 10 of them," said Buster, gesturing all around. "Like everywhere. The one at the top of the stairs has 2 baths in it." Harry started towards the stairs, only to feel Buster's hand on him. "Don't take too long. My stupid mum is coming soon, and I've got more dancing to do." "I won't," said Harry, almost disappointed at the thought of having to leave. He jogged up the sweeping staircase, past pockets of kids from his school dressed as sloths and piglets, wizards and ninjas, even a Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head sitting on the top step. The landing was enormous, corridors leading off to the left and right. Harry turned right, pushing open the first door to see an empty bedroom, then another. There were voices coming from the next door, and he peeked through to see a large drawing room. It was full of wolves, at least half of the football team inside, most of them dressed in the same shaggy grey outfits. Each of them had big paws tipped with long claws, even better than the ones that Harry had made, and their faces were half hidden inside the shadows of their sharp-toothed jaws. Harry recognised Jonah Carey instantly. He was standing at the pool table in a dirty brown wolf costume, leaning on his cue, watching another player take a shot. The balls clacked, thumping off the cushions, and Jonah's dark eyes slid in their sockets to find Harry in the doorway. "Sorry!" Harry said, his voice an octave higher than normal. He shivered in the sudden cold, Jonah staring at him without the slightest trace of emotion. "I was looking for the bathroom!" "Next on the right," said the wolf who'd just taken the shot. "Cool hair." "Thanks," squeaked Harry, scuttling away like a mouse. He pushed open the restroom door and slammed it behind him, twisting the lock and testing it twice. Only then did he ease off the mask, sliding it on top of his head. It felt so good to be free of it, and he scratched and itched the damp skin of his face as he walked across the room to the huge window. It was open, a welcome, cool air blowing in from outside, and he perched on the windowsill for a moment to get his breath back. Nobody was visible in the spotlit backyard, and it wasn't hard to see why. As well as the rain, the same thick fog had carpeted the grass, sweeping up the hill from the town. It nestled around the base of the house, rubbing away all the sharp corners and poking at the windows like it was trying to get inside. It must have been a trick of the light, but Harry thought he could see flashes of colour inside the fog, forked branches of silent lightning cutting through it. He hoped it wouldn't get much thicker. The ride down the hill was scary enough at night, especially when Buster's mum was driving. Somebody shouted something outside the restroom door, followed by laughter, and Harry hopped down from the window to the closest sink. There were 2 of them, and 2 baths, just as Buster had said. It seemed ridiculous that one house would need so many bathrooms, especially as Harry's house only had the one, and between his mum and his sisters he had to queue for hours to use it. And it seemed doubly ridiculous that Mike Carey and his psycho brother were the ones who got to enjoy it. He splashed water onto his face, cupping some in his hands and swallowing it. When he looked up, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. There was something different about him, he thought, and not just the multicoloured hair that hung down past his cheeks. There was something almost grown up there, a subtle shift. Harry had always looked more like his mum than his dad. Ooh. The phone is ringing. It's trouble from reading from an iPad. There we go. Harry had always looked more like his mum than his dad, but in the soft light of the bathroom, if he squinted a little, he could almost see Harry Hardman Sr. A smile in his flint-bright eyes. Are we still going here? Good. Oh, it's all kicking off. A smile in his flint-bright eyes. Thanks, Dad, Harry said, using the sleeves of his sweater to dry his face. This is actually a pretty cool Halloween. Still going on. Yeah, good. This is actually a pretty cool Halloween. He used the toilet while he was here, washing his hands again and walking back out into the corridor. 2 girls in his grade walked past, one a cat burglar and one a Tinkerbell, and both gave him a slightly odd look. He shook it off, making his way back to the stairs, the music even louder now than it had been before. Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head was still at the top of the stairs. He saw now that they were Kitty and Patrick from his class, and Mike Carey was there with them. He was swaying from side to side quite alarmingly, and Harry wondered how much of his older brother's hooch he'd drunk. He'd almost reached them when Buster waddled up to the top of the steps. His best friend's jaw dropped in shock when he saw Harry. "What?" said Harry. Buster waved his hands furiously around his head as if he was trying to scare away a legion of invisible wasps. Mike glared at Buster for a moment. Then his head snapped around, and he glared at Harry from the shadows of his white wolf costume. "You!" he hissed, pointing a claw at Harry's face. A face, Harry realised, with a painful kick of his heart, which was currently exposed for all to see. He pressed his fingers to his cheeks, poking flesh, and felt for the mask on the top of his head. It was right there, where he'd left it. "Intruder!" yelled Mike. "Run!" screeched Buster, and Harry did exactly that. "Get them!" Harry bolted along the corridor, almost tripping on his own feet. There was a howl behind him as Mike began to chase, then a banshee-like wail as Buster started running too. Harry knew that this was the very worst thing he could have done. When you were a fairy princess face to face with a wolf, the last thing you wanted to do was kickstart a hunt, but he seemed to have lost all control of his body. It was useless anyway, because he'd only made it a dozen yards before the drawing room door burst open, and Jonah Carey stepped out, the pool cue still gripped in his hands. He planted himself in the middle of the corridor, and Harry had to slam on the brakes to stop himself from flying into him. Buster thumped into his back, whining like a trapped dog. "Why are you running?" Harry hissed at him. Beneath the gunk of his mask, Buster frowned. "Oh," he said. "Right. "Look who it is," said Mike, strolling up. He was grinning, and Harry felt his stomach clench like a fist. How could he have been so stupid? "Harry Hobbitballs, and of course this must be Buster." No," said Buster, in a bad falsetto. "I don't remember inviting you two," Mike said, "which means you're technically breaking and entering." "And we don't like that," said Jonah, closing in. It might have been the light, but his eyes seemed even darker than before, and there was a weird yellow sheen to them, as if he was ill. He looked exactly like the kind of person who would happily throw somebody down a mine shaft, and Harry swallowed painfully. Sorry, Mike," Harry said. "I just thought, you know." He shrugged, and Mike's grin grew even wider. Downstairs, the music boomed, the beat of it travelling through the floor into Harry's legs. He could hear laughter and singing. Charlene was down there, Marlene too, and he'd never wanted to see them as badly as he did now. He hated his sisters, but he was pretty sure even they wouldn't throw him to the wolves. "No, Harry," said Mike, stepping right up to Harry and staring down at him. "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" Harry looked at Buster, but his friend just shrugged. He looked like he was on the verge of tears, but it might just have been the pus of his costume dribbling down his cheeks. "Why would I want a couple of losers like you at my party?" said Mike, scratching at his face with his plastic claws. He had definitely been drinking, thought Harry. He could smell it on his breath and see it in the way that his eyes seemed to be struggling to focus. "This party is for the cool people." "Yeah!" whooped one of the football team. They had all shoved their way out of the drawing room to see what was happening, and more people had gathered at the top of the stairs. It reminded Harry of a crowd of spectators gathered for a public execution. "And you're not cool," said Mike, prodding Harry in the chest hard enough to make him stagger back. Even though the fear ran like acid in his veins, he managed to choke back the tears. He would not cry in front of Mike Carey. "You, Harry, are the opposite of cool." "Yeah, you're hot," said the guy behind him. "No, wait, that doesn't work." Mike ignored the interruption, looking at Harry's wig, at the wings on his back, at the magic wand clutched in his sweaty palm. His expression morphed from shock to disbelief to delight. In the same fraction of a second it took Harry's heart to plop into his shoes. "Are you, dressed as a fairy?" he said, breaking into a wolf-like grin. "No," he said. "Of course not," added Buster. "He's a fairy princess." Harry tried to mentally punch his best friend in the head. Mike burst into a cackled song of laughter, actually slapping his knees. "A fairy princess!" he roared. "A fairy princess!" The laughter caught on like a house fire, and before long everybody on the landing was pointing at Harry and howling. He grit his teeth, the panic and the embarrassment and the horror almost like an electric charge fizzing up his spine into his skull. This couldn't be happening. It could not be happening. He would never be able to live it down. He glanced at Buster, wondering what foul magic he'd used to convince him to come to Mike Carey's party dressed as a fairy princess. "Enough," said Mike, the smile vanishing from his face like a mouse that spotted a hawk's shadow. Gradually the laughter dried up, and despite the thump of music from downstairs, the house felt way too quiet. Mike scratched his face, and Harry swore he could almost see real fur beneath his costume, sprouting from his cheek like he was a 50-year-old man instead of an 8th grader. His eyes burned into Harry with a terrifying intensity. "You know, my dad always said that your dad was one of the hardest men he knew. Harry Hardman, hard by name, hard by nature, that's what he used to say. Told me once he saw him win a brawl against 3 men. Single-handed. Saw him lift a broken beam off the back of a bunch of miners too. Saved their lives." Harry swallowed painfully. That last story had made the newspaper, a miner tunnel collapse that had turned his dad into a local hero. The company had offered him 3 days off, but he'd refused, of course, because he was Harry Hardman and he never missed a day's work in his life. 2 days after that, the rest of the shaft had split loose and buried his dad and 14 other men alive. Mike was lying, though, because there was no way his own dad had seen it. Robert Carey would have been up in his cosy office, drinking hot coffee and counting his shareholders' salary. "So what I really want to know," said Mike, prodding Harry again, "is how somebody like that, somebody as brave and fearless as your dad, could have ended up with a son like you." The silence on the landing was almost deafening now, except for the whistle that was screaming inside Harry's head. His mouth fell open, but no words came out. Anger had made his tongue too big, had locked his breath inside his chest. Mike smiled, and in the half-light of the corridor his teeth looked yellow and sharp. "Maybe you're not really his son," he said. "Maybe we should call you Harry Softboy." Something snapped inside Harry's thoughts, and for a moment it was as if he was standing outside his own body, watching as his hands shot out as they thumped into Mike's chest and shoved him backwards. Then he was back, his palms stinging from the impact, every single person watching as Mike stumbled, tripped over his own tail, and fell onto his backside. "Oh, crap," said Buster. Mike howled, a sound that was almost too loud to be human. He was getting to his feet, his fake claws scratching the wooden floors. "Get them!" he yelled. "I didn't do anything," screeched Buster, already running. Harry followed him, heading away from Mike and the stairs. Jonah was right there, swinging the pool cue. And Harry ducked, hearing it swoosh over his head. One of the other football players lunged, reaching for Harry with his tree-trunk arms, and he fell, crawling on all fours, scrabbling like a crab until he could bounce back up. Everyone seemed to be howling now. Mike barking orders, a dozen pairs of feet drumming on the floor. Harry looked back to see half of the football team on his tail, all of them dressed as wolves and looking hungry. And he was running the wrong way. The stairs were behind him, the corridor ahead leading into more bedrooms, and "There!" yelled Harry as he passed Buster, cutting to the side and running into the bathroom. Buster swerved hard, skidding in after him. Harry grabbed the door, slamming it shut and locking it just as somebody threw themselves against it. The wood creaked, rattling in its frame, and Harry jammed his shoulder against it to hold it in place. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," said Buster, hands in the gooey mess of his hair. "We're gonna die!" Somebody rammed the door again, knocking Harry back. He pressed himself against the wood, preparing himself for the next charge. "Buster, help me!" He looked back, seeing Buster unbuttoning his belt. "What are you doing?" he asked as the door wobbled again. Buster froze. "Fear makes me need to pee," he whispered, "and I drank all that punch." "Just hold it," Harry shouted, "and hold this." Buster ran to his side, pushing on the door with both hands as somebody laid siege to it from the other side. "You can't stay in there forever," Mike yelled, "and when this door opens, Jonah's going to toss you both down the old shaft. You hear me?" The door rattled again, the wood splitting. "Oh, it's not going to hold," whined Buster. "Of course it's not," said Harry. "It's the football team out there." "But I don't want to die." Harry looked at the far side of the room, the window still open. It was a long drop to the yard below, but if they were lucky, they'd get away with only minor fractured. A whole lot better than being thrown into the mines. "Why did you have to take the mask off?" Buster said. "It was going so well." "This would never have happened if we'd just gone trick-or-treating, you moron," Harry shouted back. "This is your fault." He braced himself for an attack, but nothing happened. He could hear Mike outside the door talking urgently. "It's your fault," Buster said, and he was about to say more when Harry pressed a finger to his friend's lips. "Hush," he said. "They're up to something." Somebody outside the door shouted, followed by somebody else, and Harry suddenly noticed that the music had stopped. His body tingled with the absence of it. He leant as close to the door as he dared, holding his breath. Footsteps, lots of them, and all running away from the bathroom. Then silence. Harry reached for the lock. "Don't," said Buster. "It's a trap." Harry slid the bolt across, opening the door a crack. The corridor was completely and utterly empty. "I'm telling you," hissed Buster, cleaning his glasses, "they're going to jump out from one of those doors and murder us." Harry stepped into the corridor, his heart drumming against his tonsils. There was no music, but he could hear another sound rising up the stairs. It started almost like birdsong, but quickly grew, a rolling wave of noise that was scarier even than Mike and Jonah Carey, one that filled Harry's bones with ice. He looked at Buster, and even beneath his makeup he could see the blood drain from his friend's face. "Is that?" Buster asked. Harry nodded, shuddering. It was the sound of 100 people starting to scream. The next chapter is called "That Sounds Like a Dinosaur." It wasn't exactly unusual to hear screams at a Halloween party, Harry thought, but there was something very wrong with the ones he was hearing now. The only time he'd ever really heard somebody scream was in the movies, unless you counted Charlene and Marlene screeching at each other, and movie screams didn't sound anything like this. They were shrill and dramatic and obviously fake, but there was nothing fake about the pulse of noise that rose from downstairs. He began to creep down the corridor, one hand on the wall just in case his trembling legs decided to crumple. Buster followed him, the bubble wrap popping as he scratched at his gloopy face. They were almost at the stairs before another noise ripped through the house. This one was more like the roar of a jet engine taking off, loud enough to make the windows rattle. It almost sounded like a dinosaur. "That sounds like a dinosaur," said Buster, pressing himself against Harry's back. "It's not a dinosaur," whispered Harry, his voice lost in a fresh wave of screams and the thunder of feet. "It can't be a dinosaur." He crept forward until the stairs came into view. The enormous entrance hall was crammed full of people, all of them stampeded towards the front door. It was hard to see exactly what was happening, because the fog from outside had filled the first floor of the house, rising almost to waist level. It swirled and curled around the crowds as they fought to escape, as thick as water and full of those same flickers of light. Harry's heart crashed against his ribs, like it too was trying to get out of the house, and his first instinct was to follow. He dropped onto the first step, then stopped. Mike Carey was down there, Jonah too, both of them struggling against the flow of people. Mike was shouting, his arms flailing as he tried to stop everyone from leaving. Harry slid his mask down over his face, hoping that in the chaos nobody would spot him. He'd made it 3 steps when the jet engine roar came again, louder this time. "I'm telling you," said Buster, "that's a dinosaur. I've got a model at home, and it makes that exact sound." "It's not a dinosaur," Harry yelled back. "How the hell could it be?" A dinosaur exploded through the living room door. Not just any dinosaur, but a T-Rex, as big as a bus with a tooth-lined jaw that could have swallowed Harry whole. It was stooping low to try to fit through the gap, but it was so tall that its head crunched through the lintel, brick dust billowing out into the entrance hall. It opened its mouth and roared again, scattering people like fish from a shark. It took a couple of lumbering steps, its tail tearing through the wall as it whipped back and forth. "That's a dinosaur," said Harry, his legs giving way and depositing him on the step. It had to be a joke, of course, a Halloween trick played by Mike and his brother. Except Mike was fighting his way through the crowds, trying to get to the front door. And the T-Rex was just too real not to be real. It snapped its jaws at a girl in a cheerleader outfit and she fell onto her hands and knees, disappearing in the fog. "That's a dinosaur," echoed Buster. "I told you." Harry's mind felt as if it was full of the same fog, his thoughts vanishing too quickly for him to make sense of them. He used the banister to pull himself up, clattering down another few steps before his brain yelled, "Stop running towards it!" The entrance hall was draining rapidly, most people now safely outside, the rest heading deeper into the house. 2 or 3 were running up the stairs, including one girl dressed as a mermaid. She wasn't running so much as jumping, as if her feet were tied together. She barged past Harry, grunting with the effort, then thumped her way down the hall. The dinosaur snapped at the fog, searching for prey. It roared again, the volume of it threatening to shatter Harry's skull like glass. Then it turned and glared up the stairs, with one beady yellow eye. "Oh no," said Harry, watching through the holes in his mask as the T-Rex sniffed at him, its huge nostrils flaring. "Don't panic," said Buster, hands out in front of him like he was an animal trainer face to face with a noisy dog. "Dinosaurs can't climb stairs." Harry was about to ask him how on earth he knew that dinosaurs couldn't climb stairs when the T-Rex lunged onto the staircase. Its body wobbled, its tail sweeping through the air as it tried to balance. Then its other foot slammed down and it pounded upwards. The whole staircase shook, the banister splitting free and crashing to the floor. It was bouncing so much that Harry almost fell too, but he lurched onto solid ground, scrabbling to his feet just as the T-Rex crashed onto the landing. It roared, ripping the chandelier away and causing a hail of glass. Harry felt the snap of its huge jaws right behind him and he ran, his arms wheeling. Buster was right beside him, screaming. "Don't look back," Harry ordered himself, but he couldn't stop himself. The T-Rex was right there, impossibly large, its head carving a trench in the ceiling, the lights sparking, dust erupting. It was gaining fast, its jaws opening for the kill. It was going to catch them. It was going to... Harry dived for the bathroom, tackling Buster and sending them both sprawling through the door just as the T-Rex lunged. It roared again, trying to turn in the narrow space, the walls crumbling like they were made of paper. Harry slammed the door shut, pressing himself against it, but Buster just grabbed his arm and pulled him away. "Are you kidding?" Buster yelled as the door shattered into splinters, the T-Rex's jaws pushing through. Harry ran for the window, grabbing the sill and hauling himself out. The yard was right there, a dozen Halloween hats carving through the fog as the kids headed for the woods. It was a long drop, but the dinosaur was pushing its way into the bathroom, breathing a cloud of rotten meat breath ahead of it. "Go!" screeched Buster, squeezing onto the window ledge beside him. "For the love of all that's holy, go!" Harry tried to push his mask up, but it was caught on something. He shuffled through the window on his backside, grabbing a drain pipe that fortunately led all the way down to the ground. The metal was cold and rough, but he held on tight and eased himself out. His stomach didn't seem to have got the message about not falling, because it slipped and tumbled and made him feel like he was about to vomit up a gallon of punch. "Move!" Buster yelled, grabbing the pipe and swinging out above him just as the T-Rex charged at the window, exploding through it with the force of a subway train. Its deafening roar turned to a squeak, its little arms snatching at thin air as it dropped onto the yard. It vanished into the fog, hitting the ground with a thump. "I can't hold on," Buster grunted, his trainers kicking Harry in the face. Harry's arms were aching too, but the wall had been completely destroyed and they couldn't get back into the bathroom. He slid down a couple of feet only to hear a winded growl below. The T-Rex was recovering, shaking itself like a wet dog. It angled its head towards them, a pink tongue worming its way over those sharp yellow teeth. "Go up!" yelled Harry. "What?" said Buster, sliding down so that his backside was practically resting on Harry's head. "Up!" The T-Rex couldn't possibly reach them, but it wasn't planning to let them go. It bit down on the drainpipe, crumpling the metal and ripping it from the wall. The force of it almost knocked Harry loose, and he clung on with everything he had, his arm muscles on fire. Buster had got the message because he was scaling the drainpipe like an Olympic rope climber. Harry planted his feet on the wall, grateful for his dad's boots because they didn't slip. The pipe shook and rattled, but it held, and step by step he made it to the roof. Buster was levering himself over the gutter, and Harry did the same, both of them rolling over the edge onto the flat expanse of tar. They lay there for a while, panting hard and shivering. Harry stared at the sky, the dark clouds smudged with dirty moonlight. There was even a little fog up here, probing Harry's face, tasting a little like copper pennies as he breathed it in. It was making his skin itch, and he scratched at his arms and neck. "That," said Buster eventually, "was a dinosaur." Harry nodded thoughtfully. "It was a dinosaur," he said. They lay in silence again, listening to the roar of the T-Rex as it ran into the woods. The whole world seemed to be spinning the wrong way, as if it had slipped from its axis, and Harry had to take a couple of deep breaths to stop a tide of panic from flooding his head. He sat up, trying once again to take off the mask. It was snagged on his skin somehow, so tight that it hurt when he pulled it. "A dinosaur," said Buster, scratching at his face. His fingers came away with tendrils of gloop, and he shook it away. "A dinosaur," Harry repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it sound less impossible. He was about to say it again when he spotted something on the other side of the enormous flat roof. "Astronaut," he said, pointing. "No," said Buster, shaking his head. "It was definitely a dinosaur." "No. Astronaut." The astronaut was dressed in a full-size spacewalk suit, complete with a fishbowl helmet and oxygen pack. That wouldn't have been unusual, of course, this being a Halloween party, but what was unusual was the fact that this astronaut was floating leisurely up past the house, gently rotating as he headed for the sky. His face was hidden, but he must have spotted Harry because he waved frantically, the movements just making him turn faster. Harry waved back, watching as he vanished into the fog-drenched air. Only then did he wonder if he should have tried to help him. "What," said Buster, "on earth was in that punch?" Harry almost laughed. Buster had to be right, of course. Somebody must have poured some hooch into the punch, and they were imagining all of this. Because dinosaurs weren't real, and people couldn't just float into the sky. And wolves didn't just climb onto the tops of houses in the middle of a party. Wolves didn't just climb on the tops of houses. Except there was a wolf, right there. It had hauled itself over the guttering and was now standing unsteadily on its hind legs. It was too dark up here to see its face, but its yellow eyes flashed as it turned its head to Harry, and when it opened its mouth, a weird, gargling howl poured out of it. It started running. Right for them. "Buster, go!" screamed Harry as he broke into a run, skidding to a halt by the edge of the roof. It was a straight drop to the ground, 30 feet below. He heard the clatter of feet behind him, Buster shrieking, and he had time to yell, "Buster, stop!" before his friend thumped into his back. Then they were falling into the night. I think I'll leave it there. The next chapter is called "This is Going to Hurt," and I'm sure it does. I hope you're enjoying that. So now you've got a sense of where it's going, this story, and the slightly supernatural element, as people do start to turn into whatever they're dressed as for Halloween, which could cause some quite severe problems, and possibly some advantages as well. Thank you very much for listening. It's been great sharing this second part of Harry Hardman's versus Halloween with you. And yeah, I'll try and get back here tomorrow. I was going to try and get it finished before Halloween. I don't know if I'll be able to, but I'll try and get it. Try and get it going tomorrow again. And yeah, we should get it finished in like 4 or 5 sessions. It's quite short. Anyway, let me know what you're dressing as for Halloween, by the way. I'll probably go as a Weezer again, even though there's no trick-or-treating this year. I'll probably just dress up as a Weezer anyway, just to scare my kids. Look after yourselves. I hope you're having a really good week. And yeah, I will see you for more Halloween fun tomorrow.